Welcome to the Lab to Table podcast, brought to you by Mérieux NutriSciences. In a world where the food industry is constantly evolving, we're here to help you break down the complexities. Join us as we sit down with some of the industry's leading experts to tackle critical food safety updates, decode shifting consumer trends, and deliver the actionable insights you need to stay ahead.
Hey everybody, and thanks for joining in to another edition of Lab to Table. I'm Mark Mantyla, and today we are here to talk about GRAS with our expert, Anna Benevente. Anna, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm great. For the audience, can you give us a little background on yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Anna Benevente. I'm the Director of Labeling Compliance and Regulatory Services here at Mérieux NutriSciences. I've been in the industry about coming up on 20 years almost, with a focus on FDA regulations, specifically labeling and ingredient regulation, keeping tabs with what the industry is up to that can potentially impact our clients in terms of the types of products that they can market and what sorts of formulations are going to be deemed acceptable. So I lead a team that does this work at Mérieux. We also do a lot of regulatory research that's sometimes a little bit outside the box. We'll look at federal or state level regulations, what's happening and kind of the patchwork of regulation that has sort of been cropping up over the course of the last few years, and just helping our clients make sure that their products are compliant and they won't run into any sort of enforcement actions, as they try and market their goods in the United States.
So Anna, tell us about the regulatory landscape, specifically GRAS, colorant reformulation. What do you see as the emerging topics in the industry?
Absolutely. So there have been lots of splashy headlines over the course of the last year and a half or so. After decades of kind of the status quo, all of a sudden there's this flurry of activity. And I think a lot of people are sort of caught off guard, a little bit unawares. And so I think it's helpful to understand first, just sort of high level, how ingredients are actually regulated here in the United States, and then how that has sort of a cascading effect with the actions that have been taken by the new administration over the course of the last year and a half or so. So generally speaking, with ingredients in conventional food products, you have a couple of different categories. By law, anything added to food is a food additive. And food additives are subject to specific FDA approval, where industry would file a petition with a ton of data, to support the safe use of an ingredient or substance in a particular product, and have to get it formally approved by FDA. And the same holds true for color additives. All color additives, even those that are naturally sourced, like some of the newer ones that have come out, like butterfly pea flower extract, even though completely natural, it still is subject to that same approval process. However, the law actually has an exemption built into it for substances that are deemed generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. And GRAS substances are deemed this by the scientific community at large. So FDA in and of itself is not the sole authority to say that something is GRAS. It's the general scientific community, usually publicly available information, either because of the substances common and historical use in food, or if there have been scientific studies to support the safety of it. So that's sort of generally speaking, the way that ingredients are regulated, and they need to have one of those statuses associated with them. So, but because FDA is not the sole authority to say that something is GRAS, companies are permitted to self-affirm. In other words, keep their own data to support the safety of an ingredient without informing FDA. GRAS substances don't get approved by FDA. There are some in regulation where FDA has affirmed that they agree that a substance is GRAS for a particular use, but they don't have the regulatory authority to demand the right to approve any GRAS substance. And so, as I mentioned, decades of the status quo and, not too much activity. And then all of a sudden, with the new administration, we see this hyper focus on food chemical safety, how ingredients are regulated, their desire to get industry to remove voluntarily synthetic colors from the U.S. food supply, sort of this flurry of activity. And so, it's not even just manufacturers that need to be concerned. Manufacturers and formulators, of course, need to be concerned, but also if you're a private label brand, if your name is on the package, even if you didn't manufacture it, you're still responsible for the compliance of that product. So, anybody that has a relationship to a particular food product needs to be paying attention. Mary was just at IFT in Chicago, like 2 weeks ago, and this is all that anybody's talking about. It's, definitely something that has gripped the food industry at large. See what's going to be happening in the coming years with FDA and the actions that they may take.
So I'm glad you mentioned self-affirming. Food manufacturers have been using expert panels to declare ingredients safe without FDA notification, but with the FDA prioritizing mandatory GRAS submissions for 2026, is that coming to an end?
It certainly seems that the administration would like this to come to an end. They've been very vocal about considering it to be a loophole, in their words. Critics in general of the self-affirmed GRAS status call it a loophole and believe that it allows companies to flood the market with, unsafe food additives. So the administration's been very vocal about trying to end this. So they have a proposed rule that's been sort of lingering for a while. It was supposed to be published back in October of last year. It has not been published as of yet, but what it would do is force companies to submit what's called a GRAS notice to the agency for any new ingredients that they plan to introduce into the marketplace. Up to this point, there's been this GRAS notice possibility, but it was voluntary. This proposed rule would propose that it become mandatory, which would, in essence, eliminate the self-affirmation process. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It's not been published yet. It's on the regulatory agenda for December of this year. But it's also hard not to imagine that it's going to get challenged potentially. Large industry players may find that it's too onerous a burden. They may not like the language in the rule. If it does get finalized, I think we would see legal challenges to it. Whether or not the law in and of itself allows FDA to mandate this, even if it's not a formal approval process, we'll just kind of have to see. So, industry does need to be paying close attention to this. The notice and commentary system that we have, here in the United States allows for pretty much anybody to submit comments to the agency for any proposed rulemaking. So I think it would behoove industry to pay attention, and when it is published, to consider whether they want to submit any sort of comments, either in support or in opposition to this proposed rule. It will create hurdles, that did not exist before for GRAS substances for sure. So it could be deemed as yet another, burden on industry. I'm sure they would consider it such. So yeah, paying attention to this is really, really, really important for food companies right now.
Speaking of legislation, state lawmakers seem to be moving pretty fast. So California is going to ban titanium dioxide and propylparaben in January of 27, and West Virginia has banned standard 11 dyes in schools. So how can national brands realistically manage reformulation and inventory when legality varies, state by state?
So this has been a unique challenge that started to emerge, right around 2023. I think the states, because of a perceived inaction at the federal level, just decided to take matters into their own hands and start, passing these rules. And to your point, industry has to face that there are challenges to then making sure that products that don't comply with California don't inadvertently get distributed there. And this patchwork has really, I think, been part of why industry has actually cooperated more with specifically the synthetic color ban that, or voluntary phase out. It's not really a ban, but a voluntary phase out that FDA has requested from industry. They're seeing the issues that they face when having to figure out how to make sure the distribution channels through the United States don't inadvertently end up with non-compliant products ending up in states that have banned certain additives. There's about 44 that seem to have the bullseye on them. Um, I know a lot of the larger companies are taking a look at this list and just cross-referencing it with their product lines to see whether or not their products actually have them, and then just reformulating now with just an eye towards making life easier in the long run by simply not having those particular substances in their products, so that then they don't have to worry about this state-by-state patchwork. Aldi issued a list of their 44 that they're looking to remove from their private label branded products. And again, there seems to be a lot of commonality of the additives that states are targeting. And so we've seen a lot of action from our clients to go ahead and just start replacing those, and then they're not going to have to worry about this patchwork.
Everyone wants to replace these synthetic dyes with natural alternatives, but let's talk about the reality of the situation. So, are companies prepared for a shorter shelf life, potential off flavors, cost increases? Are they ready for all of those things to keep up with these new regulations?
Well, it's really interesting because you have such a consumer interest and demand for companies to replace the synthetic FD&C colors with natural alternatives. Important to point out that FDA's phase out of these synthetic colors, by and large, it's voluntary. These FD&C Red 40 and Blue 1 and all of them remain on the books as approved color additives. But we've seen quite a response from industry to start swapping them out for natural alternatives. But to your point, there are a lot of challenges that they face. So for example, the natural colors may react to pH differently than the synthetic colors, their heat stability issues, their degradation issues, you know, those off flavors. If you're adding turmeric, as your color additive, it's going to bring some flavor profiles with it that may not gel well with your formulation if it's a candy or something really sweet. They also don't have necessarily the same color vibrancy, and so things are going to look a little bit different to the consumer. So the really hard part of what industry has to do is figure out whether or not consumers are going to put their money where their mouth is. There's a lot of vocal, support for the natural colors, but when a consumer is in the grocery store and they see, two packages of cereal and one is more brightly colored with the synthetic colors, will they end up going with that versus the one that's a bit duller because it's used the natural colors? Companies have to be concerned about whether or not it's going to hurt their sales, even as consumers vocalize the desire for these natural colors. And the stability issue is real. So, for example, I was in my house I was actually where I keep all my alcohol in a liquor cabinet. And I had a couple years ago purchased this beautiful bottle of purple colored gin that had been colored with butterfly pea flower extract. It was just beautiful. But I don't drink a lot of gin, and it's been sitting there now for a couple of years. And when I pulled it out a couple of weeks ago, I noticed it's completely clear. The color had completely degraded to the point where it's not even cloudy, it's not even light blue, it's completely clear. So companies have to factor all of this in. And so we recommend, certainly as companies are looking to make the change over to natural colors, that they do, sensory studies, stability studies, figure out what are the shelf life of these natural alternatives, and, do the market research to make sure that it's not going to negatively impact their sales as they make this shift. And one of the things that FDA has done as part of their drive and to incentivize industry to do all of this is they've approved a few more natural colors so that industry has options. They're also allowing them to make a no artificial colors claim on their packaging to, as a marketing bonus, where previously you couldn't actually do this. Even if you had naturally sourced colors, like your carmines and your turmerics, because it was artificial to the product itself per se, and not an inherent color, by virtue of the normal ingredients, it was still considered artificial color and you couldn't make this claim. So to incentivize industry, FDA has issued enforcement discretion, allowing them to make this claim if only these naturally sourced colors are being used. But it's it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, the reformulation process is costly, and there's certainly some risk involved with it. That is for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be quite the process. And to add to that process, going back to May of this year, the FDA finalized its new systematic post-market assessment program. So, they're actively looking backwards to reassess legacy chemicals that have been on the market for a long time. How should food manufacturers audit their, call it, the legacy product portfolios, so they aren't caught off guard when an ingredient they've used since the 80s or 90s is suddenly on the chopping block?
So yeah, Mark, FDA has been also very vocal about this post-market assessment program. They've created resources on their webpage that identify a lot of these legacy chemicals that they're going to go back and reassess. For example, they just issued earlier this year a request for information about BHA, which has been used, for decades in foods, and they're actively looking to reassess whether or not it's safe, according to the latest science. So I think companies, as part of all of what's happening right now, auditing those product lines, figuring out what ingredients they're using and which ones could potentially be targeted is really important. Now, the good news is that, and this is part of the reason why the synthetic colors is a voluntary phase out rather than FDA revoking the authorization for Red 40 and Blue 1 and all of those, is that removing additive approvals is really time consuming because of the way that our government works. There's notice and commentary. So you do have to propose it as a rule, wait for comment from the public, then finalize a rule. And so sometimes this is years in the making. So the good news for industry is if you're using an additive that has been previously approved by FDA and is in the Code of Federal Regulations, to actually remove it, FDA will probably have to propose the revocation of the food additive and then finalize the rule. And then there'll be a compliance period. Usually it's at least a year or more, before industry has to comply. So thankfully for industry, they will have the opportunity to comment on that rule. And then if it does pass, they'll have time to reformulate. But again, sort of underscores the need now for companies to have a really good sense of what ingredients are being used, which ones are somewhat controversial and could be problematic, and absolutely identify those that don't have any sort of GRAS affirmation or food additive approval now, so they can make contingency plans if those end up, in FDA's target. You want to make sure that you're ready to react if that happens.
Thanks, Anna. So to wrap everything up, let's give the audience a little bit of free consulting here. So what can food producers do to be proactive about these trends in GRAS and reformulation?
Yeah, just harkening back to sort of what I've alluded to as we've been talking, auditing those product lines, identifying those problematic chemicals, understanding which ones have an unclear status versus which ones have a clear status, either as an approved food additive, an approved color additive, or one where FDA has affirmed that the substance is GRAS. Those that don't have that, where maybe you've self-affirmed, start compiling a dossier of safety information. It may be advantageous to go ahead and file a GRAS notice even before it might become mandatory. It's sort of easy to see if they are successful in making the GRAS notice mandatory, that all of a sudden there's a flood of submissions, into that program. So maybe getting a head start if you feel confident in your safety data and all the other information that needs to be part of that, submitting that now. Paying attention to FDA's publications and announcements, responding to these requests for information or proposed rules that FDA issues, making sure that your voice is heard. Everybody wants, safe food in the marketplace, and that's FDA's job. But you also want to make sure that, good science is behind all of these decisions. So industry absolutely has an active role to play in all of this. And lastly, don't panic. Rule changes come with effective dates and compliance periods. So, if you kept on top of things and FDA does remove an ingredient of yours from the marketplace, you will have time to react.
Thanks, Anna. That's really good advice. And thank you so much for your time and your expertise today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
And for all of our listeners, thanks for listening to this edition of Lab to Table, and we will see you next time.